many Whovians had to wait for a whole year before we got the follow-up to the 2019 New Year's Day special, Resolution. 1 year of nothing, once again, until finally we got the return of Doctor Who on New Year's Day 2020 with the Series 12 premiere, Spyfall. It's funny to think that it was exactly a year since the last episode of Doctor Who. Overall, though, it was left in a good place with a decent Dalek story. So what's new with this series compared to the last series? Well, nothing much. We still have the same showrunner, some of the same writers from Series 11, with some new additions, and the same cast. A TARDIS crew of 4. We have Jodie Whittaker as the 13th Doctor. Her character has had a notable improvement since Series 11, I feel. I like Jodie Whittaker as an actor, and some of her performances are great, but sometimes I do feel that her Doctor is all over the place, and there is no real personality. The only real thing I can think of is her Doctor can be a bit of a scatterbrain at times, and while I do say there's definitely been an improvement, there's nothing which has really made me go, wow, this is one of the best moments ever. Capaldi had plenty of great moments to shine, going as far back as his first series with moments like his speech in Flatline, right towards the end of his era with a speech aimed at the two masters. His Doctor had a clear character arc, and while it wasn't executed in the best way, I still did really connect with him as the Doctor. Jodie is the Doctor, but sometimes the stories which she's been given are mainly average. Her best bits from her first series are actually the historicals, and I'm happy to say that this continues here with Series 12. The majority of her stories, though, have been fairly average at best. Stories like this, I can't even say this. After all this time, I still can't say this. The Tsurga Conundrum, that's it. With a great premise and a cute-looking Pating, ultimately, that story went absolutely nowhere plot-wise. A lot of it just didn't make sense. I felt feeling disappointed by the Series 11 finale. Some may like it, which is fair enough, but the Battle of Ranskour Avkolos, I just didn't care. What was funny was we did have some interesting character arcs in this series, but it was not for the 13th Doctor. Instead, for Series 11 anyway, it was Graham. With Series 12, I realised that Graham was the character I had connected to the most. Here is someone who has gone through the grief of losing his wife, being a cancer survivor, and most importantly, he was a bus driver. Ryan too had a character arc, probably not as interesting as Graham's, but at least he was calling Graham Grandad by the end of Series 11. Then we have Yaz, the least developed character of them all. For new viewers of the channel, you're all probably thinking that I hate this TARDIS crew in general, but it's far from it. I do like the characters, but they could be written far better. Series 12 has the same problem, so now I think it's time that I talk about the stories in this series. First off, it's the two-part Spyfall. I'm glad that we have two-part stories back in this series. It has been something which has been missing in Series 11, and while I didn't mind Series 11, it's definitely one of maybe the weaker series since the show came back in 2005. I would personally put it somewhere in the middle. I'm also glad we have a two-part story which does make some sense, and one I liked all the way through. The last two-parter we had was World Enough and Time and The Doctor Falls, and while I feel that the first part is a masterpiece, the second was a mess. Spyfall is fine. What happens in this is that the Doctor, Graham, Ryan, and Yaz are recruited by MI6 to take on aliens, and the guy in charge of MI6 is none other than Stephen Fry. It's quite weird seeing him in Doctor Who, but I can roll with it. He's a Whovian in real life after all. He gives them all a briefing of all the shit which is going down and shows them all the gadgets. If you haven't guessed by the title of this story, then by now you would know that what we have here is a tribute to James Bond. C, who is played by Stephen Fry, gets killed by some aliens. Soon after this, they begin on their mission. Ryan and Yaz start investigating a guy called Barton, who is played by Lenny Henry, a guy who is already famous for taking the piss out of Doctor Who in the 1980s. Barton is like the second villain of the story. When watching this for the first time, I thought that he'd be the main villain. We get to who is in just a sec. The Doctor and Graham travel to the Australian outback to meet up with Secret Agent O, played by Sacha Dhawan, who also played Waris Hussein in An Adventure in Space and Time. On first impressions, he seemed like a good old friend of the Doctor's, one who the Doctor is already familiar with. He even mentioned to Graham about the Doctor having multiple regenerations. Obviously, for the viewer, we don't know this guy, but it was quite interesting seeing something like this being mentioned, as we didn't really get anything about this in Series 11. So it's kind of like a nod to the past in a way, if very subtle. O always struck me as an interesting side character, and by the end of this, he was the most interesting. Back in the UK, Yaz gets took by the alien thing in Barton's office. It turns out that Barton is in league with these aliens, and for some reason, he's only 93% human. Now, I did struggle to remember why this was the case, but the reason for this is actually revealed in part 2. The plan for all the human DNA to be rewritten as part of the grand scheme of the Kasavin, and the Kasavin are the aliens that took Yaz. After Yaz touches the Kasavin, she's transported to some weird alien world. No one knows where the hell it is, but what I will say is it looked very good visually. There's the thing about the Chibnall era. The show has never looked better, and I just wish that I could say the same about the quality of the scripts week in, week out. I am one of those who actually does like Spyfall. After the weird scene in the strange place, Yaz gets transported to the outback and meets with the Doctor, Graham and O, and she just ends up there, just by coincidence. There could be hundreds of those aliens all around the planet, and it turns out that Yaz just turns out that she's going to go in the right place at the right time. Thankfully, Ryan hasn't messed up, and he soon reunites with the fam back at the outback. There's a lot of going from and going to in this story, and to some people it could be off-putting. It was for me watching this for the first time. I will hold my hands up to that. But watching the whole thing back now as a whole two-parter, I can understand why Chris Chibnall did this. After a bit of exposition, the gang decide to confront Barton. Why they didn't do this earlier is anyone's guess. It was C who warned them about him in the first place. Barton's birthday party is where the story goes up a notch. The fam all dress up in smart attire. I really love the Doctor's outfit here, and the music by Segun Akinola is really good to listen to. We have some funny stuff with the Doctor playing in the casino, thinking she's playing a game of Snap before we get to serious bits with Barton. Threats are thrown left, right and centre, verbally, between the Doctor and Barton, and before long we end up with a car chase with the Doctor, Graham, Ryan, Yaz and O. You know, just reading that out loud, that sounds like a lot of characters. But there honestly isn't. It's these parts which reminded me of how much of a satire of Bond this story is, and I've got to admit it, folks, I really love it for that. Then we get the plane scene, and this is where the story gets dialed up to 1,000,000. I was already enjoying it for what it was. It was a nice little spy romp, something I didn't really take too seriously, and I was aware that there was going to be some sort of cliffhanger because, well, I knew this was a 2-part story going into this, and wow, this is how you do a cliffhanger. Now, remember I said before how much I loved World Enough and Time as a part 1 to a 2-parter? That cliffhanger had everything. Bill was a Cyberman, and John Sims' master makes an appearance. I loved it. However, all the above I already knew about because the BBC published both the return of the Mondasian Cybermen and the return of John Sims' master. If we flash forward to Spyfall, I had no idea about O revealing himself to be another incarnation of the Master. My reaction was just like the Doctor's, a perfect reveal, and I've got to say this, I really like Sacha Dhawan's Master. He reminds me a lot of Sim. You can see in his performance that his character is broken, and come the end of the series, when he comes back again in the finale, he's easily the best supporting character which we've had in this series, hands down. Great casting. I thought that reveal would have been enough, but then when it's revealed that Barton's no longer flying the plane and the aliens appear and take the Doctor to the unknown place where Yaz was before, we get the iconic scream, end credits roll. That was a cliffhanger. To think that this was written by the same guy who gave us the Battle of Ransko Afkolos is unbelievable. But overall, Spyfall Part 1 stands up as one of the best series openers of New Who. Probably the best since the Matt Smith era, and that says a lot. In the back of my mind, though, I had not forgotten about the Series 10 finale. World Enough and Time is a masterpiece, but I did not like the Dr. Falls' conclusion. Everything fell flat. I was afraid about Spyfall Part 2, and wow, I honestly cannot believe it. It's very rare that I say this about 2-parters in general, but I think Spyfall Part 2 is better than Part 1. I'm deadly serious, and Part 1 was great. Yeah, I'm going to say it, this is the best 2-part story we have had in a very long time. The second part continues right from where it left us in Part 1. That, for me, is already a great start. I tell you why. A lot of the 2-part stories in the Moffat era became really copy and paste for my liking. Like, his Angels 2-parter wasn't too bad because they felt connected in my eyes. And then you had the Pandorica Opens and the Big Bang, which felt like 2 separate stories. You had one part being in the Roman times, and then you had another part being in the present day in some sort of weird alternate universe in the museum. And it just didn't feel like one story, and it just felt disconnected for me. I always felt we had scenario A, B and C, and Moffat went out and just used Z to try and be smart, and it fell flat and predictable by the end of his era. It was good at first, but at the end it was just like, oh yeah, I've seen this before. The Doctor Falls did exactly that. It did have its moments, but when you compare it to World Enough and Time, it is far away from what was achieved in the first part. The Master is just there wearing his eyeliner. The Cybermen were reduced to secondary villains, and the whole thing with Bill Potts dying but not dying metaphorically just pissed me off. Followed by a pointless Christmas episode. Rambling aside, I feel that both 2-parters in Series 12 do feel like 2-parters. like proper real two-parters. The stories feel more cohesive and each part complements each other. I say this despite Spyfall taking the narrative to more time zones in the second part, but we're still connected to Barton, so all that's not being forgotten about, so that's good. Well done, Chibnall. We get to learn more about the aliens, who are known as the Kasavin, and before I dive into the nitty gritty of Spyfall Part 2, my main criticism of it, if there is any, along with most stories in Series 12, is that the companions, for the most part, get pushed aside for the majority of the time. Like Graham, Ryan, and Yaz, if you think about it, they don't do much, do they? It's funny because what I've realised is that all the ideas for Graham O'Brien's character have been exhausted because most of it was covered in Series 11. And now I feel like all the companions are just there while the Doctor goes off to do her own thing. The most notable cases of this are probably in Fugitive of the Judoon, and don't worry, we'll get to that one in a bit. While I say this about companions, the best thing about this story and the majority of Series 12 is, in fact, Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor. And this is despite my misgivings with the 13th Doctor as a character. Her best moments are actually when she isn't around her companions, funnily enough, and when she's on her own or she's interacting with characters from certain stories, or whether it be the Master, Tesla, Ruth, the characters in Praxeus, Ashad, etc. This is where she shines. Her relationship to the Master in Spyfall is something of greatness. It was already established by the end of Part 1 how unhinged this incarnation of the Master really is, and I think Sacha Dhawan really nails it. At moments you can see that this character is someone who has been broken by something. It all gets explained in the finale as to why. He is a psychopath, much akin to John Sim's Master, having taken the identity of someone else, in this case a secret agent, stealing his body and pretending, probably for years, that he is an agent for the MI6 who they can rely on, and is someone who's another ally of the Doctor, who is needed when the Earth is put under threat. For all of this to be all broken apart with the whole reveal that this is actually the Master makes for great viewing. Whittaker and Dhawan really do bounce off each other perfectly, and the scenes with both of them together in this story really made me feel like this was the best proper Doctor Who we've had in ages. Yeah, stories like Rosa were bloody brilliant, and Demons of the Punjab was good stuff too, but Spyfall, in my opinion, was how a series opener was meant to be done, and it felt like proper Doctor Who. Also, can I just add, I'm so happy to see that the TCE is back. I love how the Master just shrinks people without thinking about the consequences, most notably when they're in the residence of Charles Babbage. Having the introduction of Ada Lovelace as a side character too was actually effective, surprisingly. She was a pioneer for what went on to be computing, and when it comes to the Doctor and computers or any gadgets, it's a match made in heaven for the Doctor, or hell if you're the Master. Ada works quite well as being a substitute for the fam. They're kind of like the companion of part 2 of this story, while the main companions are sort of doing their own thing in the present day, having survived the plane crash. Kind of reminds me of Mary Shelley's travels with the 8th Doctor. And don't worry, we will cross that bridge when we come to it. There's a few bridges to cross in this video, I know, but trust me, we will get there. Anyways, in part 2, not only do we have the 19th and 21st centuries explored, we also have the 20th century, and What better than to have a Nazi-occupied France during the Second World War? Soon after the Doctor and Ada arrive, they're greeted by Nazis. And guess who shows up as a Nazi leader? Nice, Chris Chibnall. You really hit us with that one. Let's have the biggest a-hole in Doctor Who history turn out to be an actual a-hole. Very fitting indeed. In Nazi France, the Doctor meets a British spy, Noor Inyat Khan, another real-life person. Chibnall really likes using real-life historical figures in his stories, doesn't he? Well, I've got to say, it does work here. I looked up Kahn after the episode aired because I didn't really know much about them, and I found out that she was the first female wireless operator in history. She aided the French resistance during the war, and quite honestly, she was one of the unsung war heroes and had an influence on how we communicate today. So in all seriousness, it was good of Chibnall to include her, and it was not just for the sake of it. What I really like is that she helps the Doctor in her battle with the Master. By this point, it was clear that it was a battle across different time zones. So much stuff was going on with the Kasavin. Barton's trying to change the world for the worse, and all of it was part of the Master's grand plan. I got goosebumps when the Rhythm of Four was brought back. I guess it confirms that this Master is possibly after John Sims' version, but before Michelle Gomez. It's hard to tell at this stage because Doctor Who is a show about time travel and it can always contradict fan theories. And I like to think at the moment that's what it is in terms of the Master's timeline. Considering that Missy became an ally towards the end of the Capaldi era, it would make sense because this Master is just back to being evil again. The broken nature of this Master is explored further on the top of the Eiffel Tower. When the Doctor and the Master start talking about Gallifrey, I felt pleased that we're finally getting some sort of continuity from previous eras. At this point, the last time we saw Gallifrey was in the ever so divisive Hellbent, and since then, it's never been explicitly mentioned by anyone apart from the minor exchange by the 12th Doctor and the Master in the Doctor Falls, talking about how he survived after the events of the end of time. Before Spyfall, I felt like both Stephen Moffat and Chris Chibnall just chose to ignore Gallifrey, which is quite sad. We knew it was safe and hidden from the Daleks after the Doctors saved the planet in the 50th anniversary, but the revelation that the Master made on the top of the tower was the start of something game-changing, which turned out to be part of the arc for Series 12. The destruction of Gallifrey and the Timeless Child. I can see the benefits of why Chibnall decided to destroy Gallifrey again, because saving Gallifrey, in all honesty, it never went anywhere, did it? It was the whole point of the 50th anniversary, and it was great saving Gallifrey after hearing about the Time War for so many years, and it changed the Doctor's outlook on everything, only to be brushed aside in Hellbent. In effect, Chris Chibnall has reversed what Stephen Moffat did and has brought it back to the state as it was in the Russell T Davies era. On the other hand, there is one thing which does bother me. Looking at the grand scheme of things, the end of this story reveals that it was the Master who destroyed Gallifrey and its people, for what we knew about anyway. He nuked the place. That was it. It was all over. One man destroys the planet. This is a man who is capable. After all, he is a broken psychopath. But when you think back to the last time this happened, when we had the Time War, it was a war which went on for centuries. We don't know every single thing about it, even to this day. Big Finish are exploring it in their audios. And it took the Daleks years until they had their so-called victory over the Time Lords. You could go so far to say that the very first act of the Time War was back in Genesis of the Daleks, when the Fourth Doctor was instructed by the Time Lords to avert the Daleks' creation. In the real world, that story came out in 1975, and we never ever heard of the Time War until Doctor Who came back in 2005. When you look at the bigger picture, that is really quite a big part of the show in terms of what directions our main characters have taken from the early days to the modern era. Back to this episode though, the Master just destroyed Gallifrey in one single swoop. That's it. No build up whatsoever. But I suppose without the build up, there would have been absolutely no shock value in the closing moments of this story, with the 13th Doctor looking on at her home planet destroyed once again, and it's by her next biggest archenemy. That is powerful stuff, and Jodie Whittaker's performance in that scene, without a single use of dialogue, is perfection. As the Doctor's heart broke once again, so did mine, and I was left really looking forward to the rest of what Series 12 had to offer. I don't think, after how pretty average Series 11 was, I could have expected Spyfall to be as good as it was. But as I said earlier, this is how a series opener is done, and it is up there with the best. The Master is defeated by the Doctor in a sound way, in more ways than one. One way is that he's turned on by the Nazis after his filter was turned off. He was left stranded on Earth and forced to live through the rest of the 20th century. Curse of Fatal Death vibes, everyone. I'd like to think that during his entire time as a prisoner, that he did escape at some point and he went on to cause some carnage on Earth without causing too much disruption. He does appear on a wanted poster on the Faceless One's animation along with Delgado's Master. One can dream that eventually Big Finish will do audios with Dhawan's Master. He'd definitely be down for it, seeing as he lent his voice in previous releases as different characters. The other way which the Master is defeated is through the Kasavin. It turns out the figurine device, which is used by Barton to change human DNA, failed because the Doctor planted a device in it in the past. The figurine was first seen chronologically in the residence of Charles Babbage. The Doctor was able to do it because she had the Master's TARDIS, hence why he was trapped on Earth for 70 years. When they find out he was going to betray them because, he is a Master, he was sent back into their own weird dimension and ended up being trapped there for a bit. Kind of like how Ainley's Master ended up getting trapped on Castrovalva and all of that. I knew that he'd be back for the finale. That was obvious, especially after we saw that hologram of him at the end. So on the whole, I love Spyfall. It was a fantastic way to bring back my favourite show after a year off the air, and it's the best I felt about it in a very long time. If I'm going to be very nitpicky, I will say that this crowded with so many characters. Yaz's family being relegated to mere cameos, Barton's mum, and the companions themselves. It's a nice side plot to have them being branded as wanted criminals by Barton, but all of my attention was on the Doctor and what the Master had to say. And in addition, what happened to Barton in the end? I would have liked an explanation of two. Gripes aside, I liked the shooty shoes, as stupid as they were. Good old Stephen Fry. So, after nearly 4,000 words, that was Spyfall. 2 episodes down and 8 to go. Next up is Orphan 55, and you know how I thought that the third episode from Series 11 was probably the best of that series? The third episode of this series was probably the worst. I think this suffers for being after a very strong two-parter. Kind of like what The Beast Below suffers for, being after an excellent series opener for Series 5. It just didn't work for me, this one. It reminded me, in a way, of Paradise Towers. The idea of there being a futuristic holiday resort where things go wrong. First off, I have to give a huge credit to the production design though, because some of the visuals in this are actually gorgeous, like when Graham is relaxing with his drink. The outside shots of the spa, which were actually filmed in Tenerife, and the dregs, even though sometimes I did need to suspend my belief that these are just people in rubber suits. It's Doctor Who. It's not real. The design of the dregs up close look quite realistic, and they look like they could be a real living creature, so that was good. I think they were spoiled by two things though. One is the way they were shot. The underground segments shown them explicitly, and I would have preferred if we had quick flashes of them. It would have made them far more memorable in my eyes. Also, the twist at the end. As soon as the Doctor locked minds with them, I knew where this was going. In fact, I knew when Yaz pointed out where they were once they went underground. This is Earth in the future. I'm not the only one who thought this, but I got a real The Mysterious Planet vibe from this. It's a shame that I think that neither story is that great, but if I had to choose, then I'd go for Mysterious all day long. At least in that story the twist was more effective, and here it was just like, oh, it's Earth. It's just crap, really. The speech at the end of this felt too on the nose as well. This is a damaged Earth. Mutated humans are the monster of the week, and I worked it out for myself that this was probably caused by the way we as humans live. All the wars, the famine, the destruction of our environment. Yeah, I get it. Doctor Who has always been a programme which has been about delivering messages. A futuristic world damaged by a war was seen in the very second story, The Daleks. That one never really gave us a big speech about how this is bad or anything though. It hit home with the message, and that was one of the things that made the Daleks an intriguing alien race and ultimately why Doctor Who has lasted. The story about a post-apocalyptic world of Skaro that led to Dalek mania in the 1960s, which was what led to the success of the show for generations of audiences. I love the Doctor speeches, but this is not one of the best ones to add to this. I hate how it just ends sort of mid-sentence, like we're in The Sopranos or something. We get a close-up of the Dreg and then, oh yeah, end credits. No. I'm sorry. This one really did not work for me. Also, what's a shame is that Ed Heim took writing duties for this. I think of his two stories, the one I'll go back to is most likely going to be It Takes You Away. And that is a story I have problems with. I went more in depth with that in my Series 11 review, so if you want to know more, then check that out. But what I will say, though, about that story is at least there were consequences for all of our main characters. Well, except Yaz, maybe. Orphan 55 feels like a run-of-the-mill episode. The cast looked like they had fun, and that's great. Production-wise, a lot of work went into this. Some of the guest stars like James Buckley are wasted here. They don't add that much. I feel like this story was too overcrowded with characters. A journey takes place in this story, and it's nowhere near as good as, say, The Ghost Monument. There, I did feel connected with the characters. Here, there's this girl, Bella, who was with Ryan. There was Kane. It turned out to be Bella's mum. James Buckley is Nevi with a weird green wig and has a son who also has a weird green wig. And I'm saving the best out of the lot until last. I know. We have the old couple. Benny, who's an old man, gets captured by the dregs and is never seen ever again. And then we have his wife, Vilma. I think since this story came out, Vilma has been the subject to the most amount of memes. Bless the actress who played her, but I have to say it, she was bad. I lost count of the amount of time she shouted for Benny. That was all she said throughout the story, and unfortunately, that is what I remember this tale most for. Not the aliens, not for the exotic locations, but for the bad acting and bad characters and Benny. It was a misstep of Series 12, but it is one which can be learned from for future stories. If written better, I think this could have been the makings of a classic. The right ideas are here, but they're executed pretty badly. It's hard to think that this came after Spyfall. Once again, the fact that Orphan 55 reminds me so much of Paradise Towers is bad enough for me, because I absolutely hate Paradise Towers. The best thing I can say about this is that it's probably better, but not by much.
And with that turkey out the way, I was apprehensive about Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. The trailers for this one were nothing to write home about at all. I wasn't excited for this one, as it was just an ill feeling because of Orphan 55. I thought that Spyfall's greatness was a fluke, and for the remainder of Series 12 we'd have dire stories like Orphan 55 or average stories like Arachnids in the UK. Thank God I was wrong. Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, great title by the way, is another historical story for the 13th Doctor. I think the strong points in her first series were the historicals. This trend continues. This story is amazing, and it is one of the underrated gems of Series 12. When I look at this episode, it reminds me of the Tennant era. In that time, there were so many fun stories, and there were alien villains, past, present and future, aliens of the week every week. The Doctor had to work out a way to outsmart them and defeat them, and it was great. Not perfect, but great. This falls right into that category. If there is one main criticism for this, and I suppose most of this series, it's that the endings feel rushed. If episodes were longer, then they'd be a whole lot better than what they already are. The guest stars are some of the most memorable ones that we've had in recent memory. Before the episode aired, I knew of Tesla, and like Ada Lovelace, I learned a few things about these real-life people after the story aired, and made me appreciate their part in history. The aliens on this are the Scythera. They are the giant scorpion-like creatures, and I've got to say, they look impressive. The Queen Scythera also looks pretty good. Many have compared her to the Empress of the Arachnos. They do share similarities aesthetically. Their main goal was to get Tesla to be their main engineer because of his wireless inventions. Thomas Edison also appears as a character in this, and as history has shown, he's received a lot more credit for inventing things such as the light bulb. The chemistry between Tesla and the Doctor is electric, no pun intended. It was a breath of fresh air to see, and it provided for great viewing. The outcome of the plot was smart, albeit rushed, but for what it's worth, I'd say you should give Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror a watch, because I personally enjoyed it from start to finish. Another of the best historical romps in the revived series. It was a great first script for Doctor Who by Nina Metiver, and I hope to see more from her in the future. That brings us to Fugitive of the Judoon. These space rhinos are back, and it was about damn time. I love the Judoon as a species. I always have, ever since I first saw Smith and Jones all those years ago. This episode hit me with a lot of nostalgia, and I'm not just talking about them. I think you all know what I'm talking about. There's so much shit to talk about just with this episode alone. In a nutshell, the Judoon patrol Gloucestershire on Earth for a fugitive by the orders of Gats, who's a character who we will talk about
again later on. There's this couple, Lee and Ruth. Ruth is just some normal, everyday person selling leaflets. On the TARDIS, there's finally a mention of the Master after the events of Spyfall. I guess that makes sense, as Chris Chibnall received a co-writing credit here alongside returning writer Vinay Patel. It was a little odd that we hardly got any mention of these events in Orphan 55 and in the Tesla story, but that's okay. When the Doctor hears about the Judoon, understandably, she isn't best pleased. After all the stuff that went down on that moon with the hospital, I'm not surprised. So once again, our fam go down to investigate. I say fam because that is soon reduced to the Doctor without really realising, but that doesn't matter. Early in the story, Graham is teleported onto a spaceship somewhere in space. Sounds vague when I write that, but that is exactly what happens. He sat bewildered on this said spaceship, like me, wondering what the hell is going on in this story. It's like he represents the audience. He hears a voice, someone familiar. Wait, it couldn't be. I'm not ashamed to say this, but this moment made me scream because I had no idea. He's back! Captain Jack Harkness, for the first time in 10 years. This beautiful man is back in Doctor Who. I never thought I'd ever see the day. This moment right here was the best moment in Doctor Who for years. If the Judoon were not hitting me with the nostalgia before, then this certainly did. And I just love all the scenes he is in. I laughed when he thought that Graham was a doctor, a running joke of this series, and I guess series 11 as well. And I love seeing his reaction when he found out that the Doctor is now a she. This is Captain Jack. It's like he never left. The biggest crime of the episode, and of the series as a whole, is that we never got to see Jack more. He only appears for a few minutes in this episode, and all he interacts with the companions. Looking at the bigger picture, he was only included as a plot device to warn the companions / the audience of the lone Cybermen. Something to get excited for in a few episodes' time. I was gutted that he never got to meet the 13th Doctor. He better return in the upcoming special, or Series 13, or fans will be mad, including myself. Jack is one of the best characters in revived Doctor Who, and despite only being in Fugitive of The Judoon for a short length of time, it was great to see that John Barrowman has still not lost his touch. How could this episode have got any better, you ask? Well, it did. Ruth Doctor. The reveal that this Doctor was the Doctor was one of the biggest shocks ever. The scene at the lighthouse with the 13th Doctor and Ruth was very well done. The direction and the music was spine-chilling. The sequence building up to the buried TARDIS and Ruth breaking the glass was well executed, and it was another nice callback to the Tennant era. So many RTD callbacks in this series, and, well, just in this episode alone. And there you have it, Jo Martin is the Doctor, and I love her. Jo Martin is great in this story because effectively, like Tennant did in Human Nature, she's playing two different characters. A normal human who doesn't seem remotely important. I never cared for her in the beginning, to be honest. It just shows how much of a good twist it was when I ended up loving her when it turned out that actually she is a Doctor. Question is though, which one? So many mysteries are still going on with this Doctor, even now. Is she a future Doctor? Is she a past Doctor? It may be explored further in a future episode, one can hope. She could be from the Unbound universe, perhaps. Anything is possible at this point, and I commend Chris Chibnall for introducing this new incarnation of the Doctor, literally out of nowhere. I did not see this coming, especially slap bang in the middle of this series. To have this shock revelation come out of nowhere is quite risky. In some circumstances, it doesn't work, but in this case, I say that this ranks up there as one of the best moments in the revived era. Fugitive of the Judoon looked like it was going to be just about some Judoon doing their routine business and arresting people. And to be honest, if this episode was going to be just that, I would have been totally cool with it, as the Judoon are one of my favourite aliens. I liked Smith and Jones. I think it was a good opener to Series 3. What we got instead here was possibly a game changer, and depending on how future stories will go, this story has got a lot of people talking for all of the right reasons instead of all of the wrong reasons. And I'm going to say it, Joe Martin works as the Doctor. I'm just waiting for the day when we get a big finish box set for her. Come on, you know it's going to happen in the next few years. Ruth Doctor is great, and I can tell by Martin's performance when she and Jodie are having their exchange in the gorgeous Harkness-esque TARDIS. She is indeed a Doctor, whether you like it or not. She looks like a Doctor with the colourful shirt and the glasses, and it just makes me smile. I love the costume that she wears in this. Also, the one who gave the Judoon the contract, you know, this Gat I was on about, yeah, she's a Gallifreyan too. I would have liked to have known more about this character, but she ended up getting herself killed too soon, as she was too trigger happy. What is interesting though is that she is unaware about Gallifrey's destruction, and naturally Ruth Doctor doesn't know because she's been disguised as a human for however many years, and her companion Lee may have been a Gallifreyan too, or it could have been a human, I don't know. If he was a Gallifreyan, he probably didn't have a clue either. The fact that none of these other established Gallifreyans in the story, apart from Jodie's Doctor, could make it plausible that perhaps there could be some sort of alternate universe stuff going on here. That would make a clear explanation for Ruth Doctor not knowing about Jodie's Doctor. It's either that or she's Season 6B Doctor. Regardless, as long as we find out and it's a good explanation, I'm all good with it. Just so long as it's not done as badly within a 60-minute Christmas special like The Time of the Doctor. When a writer sets up big story arcs, you expect them to be resolved in a good manner. I will always say that the Bad Wolf arc in Series 1 is how you do it. Series 12 sets up multiple threads, and it's even said by the 13th Doctor at the end of this very episode that all sorts of shit is going on around her with the Master, hearing from her friends about Jack showing up, Ruth, and learning about the lone Cyberman. Something is coming for her. I'd say that the final scene is probably the best scene where all the main cast are involved, and it's simplistic. It's in the TARDIS. The 13th Doctor is beyond confused and concerned about what's just happened, not fully knowing the truth of everything. A theme which gets heavily explored in The Timeless Children. Her companions are there to give her a pep talk, despite not fully knowing the truth about Gallifrey being destroyed, as the Doctor has kept her cards close to her chest. The story ended on a great note, and it really made me want to watch the next one the following week with all of these revelations. However, while I will continue to appraise Fugitive of the Judoon for how glorious it was and all the things that I've just talked about, one thing which I could say which may potentially let it down is in the future with all the payoffs. If a payoff doesn't work in a future story or series, then certain elements in this story make this more of a story which is just all about setting up another in the future. It's a bit like Iron Man 2 in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That was just a film which sets up future films afterwards, and when you look at it, it's not really one of the best. But I don't want to say that for this, because I think at this moment in time, Fugitive of the Judoon, for me, is a very, very good story. But hey, Captain Jack is going to come back again, so it'll all be fine, right? I'm sure Chris Chibnall wouldn't be stupid enough not to include him and explain everything about Ruth before his era is over, right? Right? Well, The next story is a mixed bag, according to some critics, that is. Now, I will be the first to say that I wasn't expecting something spectacular following on from Fugitive of the Judoon. After all, Orphan 55 was pretty shit in comparison to Spyfall, but in all honesty, Praxeus is a story I quite like. Pete Matteig returns as a writer, and while I do think Kablam is much better, Praxeus makes for a great story, which is simply about a contagion, which happens to be known as Praxeus. Main criticisms out of the way first, and this stems from an argument I made near the beginning of the video. Jodie's doctor just feels a bit all over the place here. This is not a criticism of Jodie at all. I really like Jodie, and she can really pull it off most of the time. But at times like this, I felt like something wasn't right in terms of writing. I could be very, very cynical about this. I don't know. For instance, when the guy who gets infected near the start of this literally disintegrates in her arms, her action just didn't feel right. It's really hard for me to explain because I know that the Doctor is an alien and is always dealing with strange things, and every Doctor does have a different personality, and that all depends on the writing and the performance of whatever actor it is. Without that dynamic, we don't have an enjoyable TV show. I think when I compare her here to one episode ago, I feel like Jodie Whittaker is playing two different characters. Like, this is another issue we have in terms of how the narrative of the series goes. We have a really serious two-part opener in the form of Spyfall, and then we have an episode immediately after with Orphan 55, which just pales in comparison. Fugitive of the Judoon is a great episode which poses great questions for the Doctor, and here we have the gang fighting against this virus. I get that the show is supposed to be something different every week. It's time travel after all. However, that doesn't mean you change the tone of the characters following on from the previous story, and you don't just forget about it and don't talk about it ever again like it never happened, because Fugitive of the Judoon has huge consequences. It just ends on a mini cliffhanger in a way, with multiple alerts with the three continents all connecting to each other, which is what we see here. So no time should have really passed for Awesome Foursome, and yet not a reference to what has happened in the last week. I don't know, it doesn't feel right to me. It feels like there should have been something which connected these stories a little bit more, because it just feels like we've gone straight to this from the last story, but we're not talking about the last story. Even just one line, like something about Captain Jack. I mean, it does get mentioned later on in the series, but I just feel like it could have been done here in this particular story as well. I may be clutching at straws here. I have done this before in my Series 11 review. I just feel like maybe if episodes came out in a different order, they could have worked maybe differently. I think it's more of a problem in Series 11 than 12 though. So yeah, I'm probably just being really, really picky. Apart from that, I have no other real complaints apart from the fake looking bird seen around the middle of the episode. I get that this is part of the main threat, but couldn't they have done better? It looks just as bad as one of those cats from Survival, a story which is over 30 years old. The special effects department may have had an off day with this one, and usually I'm full of praise for the special effects team, especially with the Chris Chibnall era, but here it just looked a bit crap, to be honest with you. Moving on to the positives though, and I think the episode deserved more merit than what has been suggested by many reviewers, and certainly after what I've just rambled on about. I like how this story is set in 3 continents, even if stuff doesn't happen in one of them, and
that's okay. Yet again, the TARDIS team have split up. Yaz and Graham go to Hong Kong. They're joined by ex-police officer Jake, who's looking for his husband, Adam Lang, an astronaut who's crash-landed. Ryan is in Peru and he finds a video blogger whose friend was killed by the virus after coming into contact with the birds. In Madagascar, the Doctor finds medical researchers Suki and Aramu. One of the strong points of this episode, like Bataig's previous effort with Kablam, the supporting characters are actually engaging. The most engaging are Jake and Adam. One of the standout scenes is when Graham talks to Jake. Jake talks about how he feels he hasn't always done things right in his marriage to Adam. At this point in the story, Adam's just been found in the lab in Hong Kong and he's infected, but his condition could be curable by the end of the story, and turns out he is cured, thanks to a bit of scientific technobabble. The relationship is something I cared for in this episode, and it's about time that Doctor Who showed a gay relationship which felt a bit more mature than previous attempts, so I really commend the team for that, and I really commend the actors for that as well. They really did play an engaging role, I feel. The other characters I also liked. I liked the blogger. Wasn't too keen on the scientists because we hardly knew much about them. However, that is probably due to the twist that Suki is actually an alien humanoid, one of the same race of humanoids seen earlier by Graham, Yaz and Jake in the lab. Aramu, though, is just killed on the beach in Madagascar, and it's like something out of a Hitchcock film. He is probably the least interesting character in the entire story. It's a shame, really. It turns out the reason Suki and a few other humanoids came to Earth was because she wanted to find a cure for Praxeus, as it is a bacteria which has infected her entire species. The Doctor and co go down to the bottom of the ocean, which is where Suki's ship is. The more I go on about it, the more I realise that this episode is a little bit rushed. Enjoyable, but rushed. Suki's infected and the Doctor cannot save her in time. Luckily, the Doctor's test subject, Adam, was cured on board the TARDIS. After this, the humanoid ship needs to be used in order to cure the whole of the Earth from the pandemic, and then case closed. But there's a catch. Someone needs to pilot the ship, and Jake takes on the responsibility. Now, I have to admit, I can see the reasoning behind this. If you remember the conversation he had earlier in the episode with Graham, Jake has never made the best decisions in his marriage to Adam. Now that Adam's safe, it's like Jake feels it's the right thing to do to try and save mankind, knowing he has no chance of survival and the ship will be destroyed. Luckily for him, though, the Doctor saves him in the last millisecond by materialising the TARDIS around him. And I know what you're all thinking. It's been said many, many times on social media. Why didn't the Fifth Doctor do this with Adric? I know, but there you go. The day is saved. Overall, a good story, but it suffers similar problems to the Tesla episode, that it feels rushed, especially towards the end, and it makes it feel or look a bit polished almost. Also, why did Yas suddenly decide to do something in this episode? She chose to stay behind in Hong Kong, find a transmat to the base under the sea, and that's it. She has really been wasted as a companion, even in this series. Same goes for Ryan in this series as well. On repeat viewing, I found Praxeus better. I can sort of see why people are divided on this one, but I'm happy to report that I'm one of those who does like it while realising that there are some flaws with this. But as a story, I think it's fine. Another story which I'm still divided on and quite split about is Can You Hear Me? The first ever Doctor Who story which is actually a question in the title. This
was written by Charlene James, the second black woman to ever write for the television show after Mallory Blackman for Rosa. I'm going to be frank here and say this, and I might sound like I'm going all over the place. I love when Doctor Who's scary. It gets me excited. This, though, sometimes it felt unsettling. There was something about the dreams and the way that the fingers detached from Zellin's hand. Certainly not a Doctor Who story I'd be showing to children. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. That's probably just me. Another example are the husks in Ghostlike, and damn, they were scary. Oh god, so unsettling. Back to this, though, I'm kind of on the fence because it has so many great ideas. I think Ian Gelder was a great villain in the form of Zellin, by the way, and he easily stole the show. The main cast are great here, and yes, the companions do get something to do here as well. We learn of their greatest nightmares. Ryan has nightmares about the dregs because, well, who doesn't have nightmares after watching Orphan 55? Graham dreams about his time when he's getting treated for cancer, something which has been part of his character ever since his introduction in The Woman Who Fell to Earth. Grace is there in the nightmare or dream, and he's back there in that awful time in his life, but he has the comfort of knowing that his nurse, Grace, was the one who got him through it, and she became the person he loved, and clearly he still thinks about her a lot because he's dreaming about her. She's part of his subconscious. Now, as for Yaz, I think I'll talk about this before I get to my summary of the episode. Let me tell you about why I'm divided about this episode properly. I felt that the scenes with the nightmare creature were not needed, and the worst thing about this episode starts in Aleppo, Syria 1380, and it's supposed to establish a few things that's going on, so that screen time, which I think's been wasted already in this episode. What this should have been was the main characters, their friends, and the main villains, and I think that would have made me feel more positive about this episode. In the end, this subplot just goes nowhere and it feels out of place. If we had a whole episode just dedicated to this, then maybe I'd be more forgiving of this as an idea, because I think the idea is good, but I just feel like there's too many ideas, and I think that's how this particular story suffers. I like the design of the creature. We don't get to see it much either, but in all honesty it doesn't add anything at all. Also, I think while Ian Gelder is one of the highlights of the episode, with him possibly being connected to the Guardians and Eternals from the classic series, his presence is overshadowed by this other powerful god, Rakea, who turns up towards the end, and she doesn't seem to do much. Considering these guys are all powerful beings, I feel like they are defeated way too easily by the Doctor. They can create these dreams and nightmares, and yet are scared of the nightmare creature, which was introduced earlier in the episode. What? That doesn't make sense. Pushing the stupid resolution aside, though, I think that Zellin is a great villain alone, and I think maybe the story could have been better if he was just a sole villain, maybe. I can't say the same about Rakea, as not enough screen time was invested in her character. Most of the story was her trapped in a prison. Talk about all-powerful, you're stuck in a prison for all of this time. In addition, the main characters are all in prison, with no way out, and how does the Doctor save everyone? By literally using the Force and using the sonic screwdriver to get out. No. That doesn't make any sense either. One thing which I felt quite shocked by was one of the last things in this episode, which gave me a mixed signal about this episode as a whole, and it was the conversation between Graham and the Doctor. Now, from what I can gather from this episode, Graham's biggest fear is that the cancer might be coming back, and he still has regret over Grace's death. This is one of his defining characteristics. It was really touching to see him talking to the Doctor about it, and I was really pleased to see a character moment between these two, as I felt like we've not really got much of this in Series 12 as opposed to Series 11. But the Doctor's reaction to this was not what I expected. I thought that there'd be a back and forth, but instead the Doctor just didn't know how to respond, and I really don't know how to feel about it. Evidently, many people have not reacted great to this, with some complaining to the BBC about it. Now, having watched other people's reviews and then rewatched the scene again multiple times to try and understand why I was feeling this way about this particular moment, I think I can say that it could have been handled better. The Doctor not knowing what to say isn't because she doesn't care. Of course she cares. She even admits that she's socially awkward. She simply does not know how to reassure Graham. Graham is alright because he has someone. It was the Doctor. And he says that as well. However, I think it would have been much preferred if the Doctor did give Graham some reassurance and to comfort him about his feelings. This episode packs an emotional punch, and I think if the scene was played out a bit differently than what we got, I would be feeling much better on last impressions before the credits roll. Can You Hear Me deals with a lot of themes, adult themes, and I never thought that it ever be tackled in Doctor Who. We've seen dreams and nightmares before in different stories, but I think the most heartbreaking of all of them has to be Yaz's story. This is the most character development we've ever had for Yaz. Hints to her biggest fear were planted all throughout the story. When she sees her sister mentions an anniversary. When you look at the episode in retrospective and realise what Yaz's sister meant, this means a lot. The flashback scene of 3 years ago with Yaz sitting on her own by a road in the countryside really hit me because I knew where this episode was going then. Yaz ran away from her home because she was mentally depressed, and at this point she had suicidal thoughts. Never have we seen a main character in this show go through something like this, and it was heartbreaking to watch, but also great to see the police officer talking Yaz out of it. And she's the main reason why Yaz became a police officer. This slightly changes my perception of this character now. I can't forgive the writers for not utilising her properly before this episode came out. Moreover, as Mr. TARDIS Reviews quite rightfully said in his own review of this story, Yaz's mental health is something which should have been brought up much, much sooner. When given the right material, Mandip Gill is great to watch. Seeing this character go through this really hit home on a personal note, and it is the saving grace of this story. I really hope that Yaz gets utilised better, and if she is sticking around for another series, I hope that she gets better treatment, and I hope that she gets more character growth, because this really adds a growth to her character and Mandip Gill as an actor. So overall, Can You Hear Me? It has positive messages, but narratively it's all over the place, and it suffers from being too rushed and having too many ideas. Perhaps if the story was simplified, I rank this as one of my favourites of the series, but in the state that it's in, it falls down, which is a shame because Charlene James is a writer who is good at tackling adult themes in the works that she's produced. It will be interesting to see if she writes for Doctor Who again. If she was to write for Doctor Who again, I hope that next time she would have a script which is more focused, because too many things go on for something which only lasts for 50 minutes. And this brings us nicely to episode 8, The Haunting of Villa Diodati. First of all, I love the title. It feels like something which has been plucked right out of the classic series. This episode is a game of two halves. For the most part, the story is your typical haunted house story, but done better than the likes of Hyde. It's run-of-the-mill, but I'm fine with that. The premise of the story is that the Doctor wants to take her companions to Villa Diodati to see what influenced Mary Shelley to write her novel Frankenstein. Apart from Mary Shelley, there's other famous historical figures in this story. There's Percy Shelley. This story is set in 1860, prior to he and Mary getting married. Their son William, who is just a baby, is present in the villa as well. There's also Lord Byron, who was the father of Ada Lovelace, who, as we know, appeared in the second part of the series opener, Spyfall, and there was Claire Claremont, the stepsister of Mary Shelley. So they are our main guest stars for this instalment of Doctor Who, and let me tell you, they are great. Yes, some got more screen time than others, but for what it's worth, I don't think that detracts much from the story. The whole cast are clearly having a lot of fun here, and I can see why so many are saying this is one of the standout stories of Series 12, and quite rightfully so. The guest stars are so much fun to watch. Seeing them dancing with the Doctor and their companions near the beginning was entertaining. Seeing everything go pear-shaped when supernatural stuff keeps happening in various places throughout the villa, the rooms changing and things appearing and disappearing, walking through walls. The scary tones from previous episode really do carry over, but in this case it's more of a gothic horror way, and I prefer that, as this is something which is more familiar for Doctor Who, and it's something which Doctor Who was notable for, especially during the Philip Hinchcliffe era, and I personally like this method of storytelling a lot more than in the last episode, when the whole idea of dreams and nightmares were some of the most engaging parts of that plot. Here we have literal horror elements coming into play here, and I think I prefer this. As another newcomer to Doctor Who in terms of writing, Maxine Alderton did a fine job here. The subtle nods to real-life events are scattered all around the episode, and it's quite disturbing when you investigate it further after you've watched it. For instance, there's a really dark scene when Mary sees that her child is nothing but a skeleton inside the cot. The image itself is disturbing, but knowing in real life, at this point in Mary Shelley's life, she's already lost a child. That is pretty dark. Even for Doctor Who standards, that's pretty dark. But it's a clever little reference, which is being subtly made by the writer. I love the imagery of the spectre appearing all throughout the villa, with no one knowing quite what it really is until around the half-hour mark, when the story completely shifts in tone. The use of skeletal hands, another piece of gothic imagery. In Shelley's novel Frankenstein, the creature is something which is already dead. That is the only thing I can take from that, because skeletons are usually the dead. Otherwise, why were the hands crawling around the place? I would have liked more of an explanation. I may have missed something, maybe. So if I have, then please let me know. Then again, many stories have gone unexplained for years, and they'll never get explained, probably. Now this brings us to the turning point. The revelation that the thing that keeps appearing in the villa is none other than the lone Cyberman, the very thing which Captain Jack warned us all about. I've got to say this. The lone Cyberman is one of the single best things which has been done to the Cybermen. Through the years we've had different villains who have been figureheads for the Cybermen, but this guy, whose name is Ashad, is one who isn't to be messed with. His design says everything you need to know about him, and the performance by Patrick O'Kane makes for the best physical performance by a Cyberman actor since David Banks in the 1980s Cybermen stories. This guy is a menace. His emotions are all over the place. He hates what he is, but he also wants to start a new empire of Cybermen after their destruction in the Cyber Wars, something many Whovians have known about since 1975's Revenge of the Cybermen. Say what you will about the last 3 episodes as standalones, but this guy is really interesting and makes for one of the best villains from the past few years. What makes him better is that he is a Cyberman, a villain I love. My retrospective of the Cybermen has gained quite the viewership over the past 4 years, and it just goes to show that many people love the Cybermen. I love the Cybermen, and in recent years I feel they've been mistreated. I will mention this again when I talk about this in the finale, but for now all I can say for definite is that The Haunting of Villa Diodati on its own as a single standalone story is potentially the best Cyberman story that we've got ever since their first appearance in the revived era. The best single episode is still probably World Enough in Time, but because the Doctor Falls is a second part of that same story, it brings it down for me. What I love about this is that there's just this one guy who isn't fully converted. You can tell through the design. You can sort of see like one of his arms is like off a Mondasian Cyberman, and then all the rest is like your Nightmare and Silver Cyberman. His emotions are still partly intact, and it makes for some great dialogue between him and the Doctor. Also, Jodie Whittaker gives one of her finest performances in her role as a Doctor so far. She absolutely smashes it in these scenes with Ashad, and I really appreciate that Jodie herself knew just how much of an impact the Cybermen as a villain have had on the show for over 50 years, as well as a main character. Don't forget, the last time the Doctor encountered the Cybermen on screen was in The Doctor Falls. In that episode, the 12th Doctor lost Bill, and they were partly responsible for the regeneration which led to who the Doctor is now. I think because Jodie was aware of this previous story with Peter Capaldi sort of fueled her in her performance when she's confronted the Cyberman. You can see that she is pissed off to see this guy, just like the 9th Doctor was pissed off at seeing a Dalek in Van Statten's Alien Museum in Dalek. Just like that story, the Doctor taunts the main villain for its weakness. The irony here is that Ashad still has the hint of emotion, but it's mainly anger. I can't tell you how pleased I was to see the Cybermen written this way. For once it was something different. I really like Maxine Alderton, and I think she knocked it out of the park here with the writing of this dialogue in this story. One line in particular which digs deep into the lives of the Shelleys is when Ashad talks about sparing the life of baby William. Earlier on, he had the opportunity to kill him, as he's already killed a couple of others. He remarks that William is weak. Now, at the time of watching this, I didn't think too much of this line. I didn't read too much into it. But after seeing Mr. TARDIS Review's video on this episode, yeah, I mentioned him again, so huge shout out to him. It turns out that the writer here could be referencing the fact that in reality, 3 years after the events of this story taking place, William dies anyway. Now that is dark, and it's also genius at the same time. Anyhow, the whole reason that there's a Cyberman in this story in the first place is because Ashad has travelled back in time to look for the Cyberium, a silver liquid substance which can possess any living organic host. The Cyberium contains all the knowledge of the Cybermen. Therefore, it's essential in giving the Cybermen a chance to win the Cyber War and essentially revive them. Ashad ended up here because Percy is possessed by the Cyberium.
The Doctor finds Percy in the cellar, she releases it from his body, and ends up possessing it herself in order to stop Ashad and his plans to save the Cybermen. But the Doctor is easily provoked when he threatens to destroy Earth, meaning a paradox could occur, and she ends up giving it to him, deeming Jack's warning useless. I'll tell you something, Captain Jack will not be happy the next time he sees the Doctor. This better get mentioned. The story ends with Ashad getting away, setting us up nicely for the two-part finale, and with our main guest stars using their encounter with Ashad as an inspiration, in particular Mary's experience with the half-man, half-machine partly inspiring her to write Frankenstein. Overall, it's a nice ending, and overall, this episode really was one of the best episodes of Series 12. And it was a great Cyberman story, something I rarely say these days, which is very sad. So that's a huge positive. If I'm going to be negative, I'd say that this could have really benefited a whole lot more if this was a two-part episode, because, once again, some things were not resolved by the final stretch, and again, the ending, while good, did feel a bit rushed and just cobbled all together in a sort of thing. That's like the whole story of this series, really. There's a lot of stories where they just feel rushed towards the end. There's a lot of great ideas, and because of that, we end up with too many ideas, with some ideas being better than some others. Another thing I wonder about is why did we have the skeleton hands crawling around the place and strangling Ryan? I mentioned this earlier. It was cool to see, don't get me wrong, but it was never explained why they were there. Was it something to do with Percy? And Graham telling the Doctor he saw ghosts, with the Doctor providing no explanation at the end. That was a bit baffling. Also, one episode after her best, Yaz ends up doing nothing again. Come to think of it, I don't think any of the companions do much other than reminding the Doctor of Jack's warning and doing the same usual stuff like asking questions. This is one of the episodes where they got wasted again. Finally, another thing I'd like to bring up about this episode, and this is nitpicking again, it's the whole Big Finish thing. Now, for those of you who are not aware, I consider most of Doctor Who audio plays by Big Finish to be canon. It was even confirmed in The Night of the Doctor, which was written by Stephen Moffat. In that, the Eighth Doctor mentions most of the people who he's travelled with. Now, in my mind, that made all the audios featuring the Eighth Doctor canon. In 2011, there was a trilogy of stories that came out as part of the monthly range of audios, and it had the Eighth Doctor. In this trilogy, Mary Shelley became his companion. One of the stories in this trilogy, known as the Silver Turk, features a Mondasian Cyberman. My main gripe here is because in my head this is canon. Where does all of that fit in? Obviously there's no mention of this in The Haunting of Villa Diodati. I don't think many will give a shit about this, to be honest, but I really wish there was some sort of reference to this. Even one line would have saved that bit for me. I had an idea before broadcast that the audios would not be brought up, and it is sad of me to think badly of this story for not referencing it in some way, maybe Big Finish will do something in the future which addresses this. After all, Big Finish have fixed up a lot of issues which were brought up in the show before, improving on characters and adding a lot more to the lore. That sounds insane, but because I consider the Eighth Doctor audios to be canonical, I think that actually detracts a little slightly from the haunting of Villa Diodati, and this is something which is probably not even the fault of the writer, because despite that, this episode is one of the highlights of Series 12. It does a good job of setting up a two-part finale, and that is what I'm going to talk about next, and oh boy, there's a lot to talk about. First of all, I hate to bring this up again for this same review, but remember how I said how much I love the Cybermen and how the haunting of Villa Diodati handled one of them perfectly, and how other stories like Closing Time, Nightmare in Silver, and the Series 8 and Series 10 finales do an incredible disservice to them. Well, guess what? The same sort of happens here for this two-part finale. Again, like World Enough and Time, Ascension of the Cybermen is a brilliant standalone episode for them, but then, in the second part, they're reduced to secondary villains. I really hate that, because I think the Cybermen really do deserve better than that, especially after so much build-up ever since Captain Jack's warning in Fugitive of the Judoon. I can see a pattern emerging here. In the Series 8 finale, Cybermen were secondary villains to Missy. Series 10 finale, they were alongside the John Sin Master and Missy. And now in the Series 12 finale, Sacha Dhawan's Master makes a return. And in fairness to him, he steals the whole show in the second part. But why is it that in the last three finales with the Cybermen, we've had the Master show up to be the real big bad? For me, it just takes so much of the limelight away from them. They are the second most popular villain after the Daleks, and yet every time we seem to have a big story with them, the Master shows up, and suddenly they become secondary villains and cannon fodder in a way. Why do writers like doing this? This is why I'm so glad that we did have the haunting of Villa Diodati before this, at least in that Ashad on his own was the main villain. Essentially, the Cybermen is a great way to follow on from the last story. The teaser at the beginning was really good, but there was one thing I noticed straight away. This episode uses the RTD Cybermen, and I'm okay with this. I was never a fan of the Moffat era Cybermen, so seeing these turn up alongside Ashad was really cool. Other things I thought were really cool, but stupid at the same time, were those cyber drones, which were like floating Cyberman heads. Like, what the hell was Chibnall smoking when he came up with this idea? Did he watch Dimensions in Time and use floating heads of the first and second Doctors as inspiration? Probably not, but it's good to speculate. Ascension of the Cybermen is a fast-paced episode, and it does work being part one in this story for being like this, but it also suffers from this as well. I was very worried as the settings kept shifting. One minute we have the Doctor and her fam fighting with the Earth's last survivors against the last Cybermen. Next we have something on island with a guy called Brendan. As intriguing as this was, for part one at least, this felt like it did not belong here, and this just reminded me too much of the tropes Moffat had in many of his episodes, going from A to B to C and giving us Z. And this was not a good sign for me. Ignoring all of that, and a bit of clunky dialogue here and there, essentially the Cybermen managed to get to the finish line, although it was a bit bumpy on the way. After a couple of missteps along the way, it gives us another memorable cliffhanger, which rivals the Master's reveal at the end of Spyfall Part 1, and it is revealed that, oh, the Master's back, and Gallifrey's in this story too. But I'd be lying if I say I was not excited for the Timeless Children. But before that, I'd like to talk about all the best things about Ascension. The best part of the two-part finale is Ascension of the Cybermen, easily, and it's mainly because of the Cybermen. We have Ashad and the two RTD Cybermen trying to rebuild the Cyberman Empire after they're all destroyed after so many battles, and towards the end we saw the awakening of the new Cyber Warriors, which are gorgeous design wise. Going forward, I want to see these Cybermen return, and for the love of God, have them appear in a story which is just about the Cybermen being the main threat. Please do that in the future. I don't want to see another story where the Cybermen appear and you think, oh yeah, they're going to be the main threat, and then all of a sudden another villain appears and the writer turns around and goes, oh, got you, actually, these are the main villains. I want a Cyberman story. That's all I want. Not too much of an ask, so please, writers, do that for me. The supporting characters I wasn't too invested in this, to be honest. They were alright, but I think the problem was there were too many of them. In addition, when some of them get killed by the Cybermen across both parts of this story, I wasn't really affected by it because I hadn't invested in these characters. If these characters were written like the husbands from Praxeus, then I would say the opposite, and then I'd go on about it. But there's not much to talk about here for this particular case. One of the characters who did interest me a bit, though, was Harkness. He was a hermit survivor on the planet who has learned to survive during the Cyber Wars, and he did intrigue me in a way. It turns out that he was responsible for sending the Cyberium back in time, as revealed in the last seconds before dying in The Timeless Children. He wasn't the best character in the world, but out of the guest goodies that we've got in this two-part finale, he was easily my favourite. I liked the others who survived, but they were just there for exposition in my opinion, and most of this finale is that. But from what we got in the first part, it was bloody exciting seeing these new Cybermen coming out of their chambers. It felt like a modern take on Earthshock. What pisses me off though is these Cybermen can't shoot for shit and they end up being like stormtroopers. The Daleks went through a similar phase during the Matt Smith era, so this is nothing new. I do stand by what I said though. These Cybermen need their own story. I don't want them playing second fiddle to another villain like the Master or anything like that. The Haunting of Villa Diodati proved that this works, so I hope someone will give them better material in future episodes, because the concept of the Cybermen as villains are still engaging over 50 years since their first appearance. For most of this outing, the TARDIS crew split up yet again. The Doctor and Ryan go off with Ethan. Oh yeah, there's some guy called Ethan. Yeah, I didn't really care about Ethan. Sorry, Ethan. They go to find Harkness. The Doctor received a threat from Ashad, which ties into the second part of the story. More on that later. Grim and Yaz are with the other survivors who they met near the beginning of the story, and they see the new Cybermen being brought back to life. And, I kind of see why this was done. The two groups in two different places allow for all the plot points to move along. Do all of them come full circle? Well, I'll let you all be the judge of that, but I don't think they do. After all, this video is not the definitive view that one thing is good and another is bad. No one's review is right. Review is an opinion, and my short review for Ascension of the Cybermen is that it's great fun, but it is filled with some exposition. The action set pieces are great, Ashad is still great, and for me, the episode suffers the same fate as World Enough in Time, because the second part of this story is what brings this down, and coincidentally, that is what I'm going to talk about now. If the current climate of Doctor Who fandom is anything to go by, The Timeless Children is one of the most divisive episodes in the show's history. As a huge fan of Doctor Who, I myself had negative thoughts about this after its initial airing. As mentioned earlier, the way it was set up after Ascension of the Cybermen, with the portal being activated on Harkness' planet, revealing a gateway to the destroyed Gallifrey and the return of the Master, I was very excited. In the back of my mind, I was aware that it could be a letdown because of episodes like The Doctor Falls. I hate to say this, but The Timeless Children makes the same mistakes. Now, let's take the main focus of this episode. It centres around the Doctor and the Master and the history of Gallifrey. We'll get to find out the mystery of the Timeless Child, which has been sort of like an on-off story arc for this series, and it was mentioned in a throwaway line in The Ghost Monument. It's funny to think that something mentioned in that episode is now like a big plot point, but okay. Meanwhile, there's all of the stuff with the Cybermen still going on, and as I mentioned numerous times before, and I'll mention it yet again, I do not like the way the Cybermen have been treated in this particular episode. But that's not my main problem. I think you all know what my main bugbear with the Timeless Children is. It is the reveal of who the Timeless Child is. And yeah, it's the Doctor. But I really wanted it to be the Candyman. Joking aside, I have rewatched this episode since, and it's probably the episode which I've rewatched the most because of how my thoughts and feelings have been, and I've really thought about this episode. And since I've watched this, I've watched some videos on YouTube from some of my favourite YouTubers who make sense, like Batman March, and I do feel better about this idea than when I did initially, and that's thanks to people like Batman March. So I want to give a huge shout out to him and other people like Mr. TARDIS Reviews. Also, just to clarify, I'm not one of those who declare that Doctor Who is dead after the broadcast of this episode. I would never say anything like that, and I never will. This does not ruin anything. It just changes a few things we know about the Doctor and the origins of the Time Lords. Everything which is explained by the Master through the use of the Matrix is done well. It is well acted by Jodie Whittaker and Sacha Dhawan. The whole story of Tecteun discovering the child and how the child regenerated, and Tecteun discovering the ability to regenerate does make sense. Tecteun was from Gallifrey, but no one on Gallifrey had this ability to regenerate, but the child did. Tecteun was a Shobogan, not Gallifreyan. Shobogans were mentioned in The Deadly Assassin. I'd like to think that she was one of the outsiders, which we've seen before in other stories like The Invasion of Time. All of that makes sense. Eventually, when the Time Lord Society is set up, the Lords of Regeneration are drawn clear to what we already know. Every host can only regenerate 12 times, meaning that they only have 13 lives. The Timeless Child was implied to have multiple regenerations, possibly an endless amount, before being adopted by Tecteun. However, after the division interrogate the Founderling, who is the Timeless Child, the Founderling's memories are wiped out, and after that what we get is the First Doctor. Everything we know after this stays the same. William Hartnell is still the First Doctor and always will be. The Timeless Child was another set of lives that the Doctor had but didn't even know about, as we as viewers didn't know about before this episode came out. It was asked before many times in this TV show if there had been incarnations before Hartnell. The Brain Morbius had a montage of the faces before Hartnell. I always thought that they were just Morbius, but now it's canon that they are actually previous incarnations before the First Doctor. And that saves it for me. Was this necessary? Personally, I don't think so. It does not change the Doctor as a character. If you really don't like it that much, then just ignore it, because someone will come along and just retcon it again in a few years anyway. Remember the hybrid a few years ago? And that's been forgotten about, or should I say ignored by the writers, because the whole idea received a backlash from fans. Therefore, I for one at this stage am not fussed about the Timeless Child plot point, because it does not change anything for me. I will still refer to William Hartnell as the First Doctor. The Timeless Child never called themselves the Doctor. Likewise, this does not ruin Matt Smith's regeneration when he needed regeneration energy from the Time Lords. He was dying because he no longer had the ability to endlessly regenerate. He was at the end of what we knew as his 13th life. I must stress that this does not ruin Doctor Who. People need to get this into their heads. This is just another story which someone has written. They have given their own take on the origins of the main character as well as the Time Lords. All of the stuff with Omega and Rassilon still happened. They are still founding fathers of Gallifrey. We didn't really get any mention of them here because I think that would have confused a lot of the general audiences who have not watched any of the classic series or do not know any of the extended material through books, comics and Big Finish audios. The Timeless Children implies that the Doctor and the Master were lied to. That's fine. How many times in Doctor Who have the Time Lords been arseholes? In all seriousness, barring the Master, you have Rassilon, who was a dick when we saw him in The End of Time and in Hellbent. Omega was just the same in the two stories he showed up in. Omega was just a title which that character called themselves, like the Doctor or the Master. For all we know, Tecteun could be one of those Time Lords and receive the same treatment from the Division, a mind wipe. It is pointless to speculate too much, as this may be something which never gets answered. At the end of the day, this episode now exists and we have to accept it. Do I like it? No. Do I think it ruins Doctor Who as a show? No. The show is constantly evolving, and with each writer comes new ideas. Some really work, like the Ruth Doctor, whereas others don't work, or at least for me anyway, and that's the case for the Timeless Child arc. Anyway, that's not all I dislike about this episode. I dislike the fact that the Cybermen are just made to look really stupid here. I for one was disappointed when Ashad was killed by the Master in just a few seconds. It's like Chibnall thought there were too many ideas in the story and he had to get rid of Ashad, who was one of the most interesting new villains to appear in the show for years. Ashad's grand plan for the Cybermen came to nothing in the end, and as the Master put it, it was just to turn them into robots, as the new race of Cybermen would be purged of organic tissue. Bad plan, which in the end did not go ahead. Thank God, because that would have ruined the whole idea of the Cybermen. He turned out to be the key in defeating the Cybermen and the Master in this episode, though. The Master killed Ashad to get the Cyberium, because, as we all know, Ashad got it from Percy Shelley. With the Master in control, he uses the corpses of deceased Time Lords, converts their bodies, and creates the Cyber Masters. This idea is dark as hell. Having a new race of Cybermen who can regenerate is a cool concept, but I have to get this off my chest. These new Cyber Masters look ridiculous. Whether this was the intent, I don't know. But I think when I saw them for the first time with those robes and collars, I just lost my belief. And bearing in mind at this point, I was pretty pissed over the Timeless Child arc, first time viewing and everything. In the end, the way they were all defeated was a cop-out. Ashad had a weapon inside his chest. If detonated, it could destroy all life on a planet. Despite being shrunk to death by the Master's TCE, the weapon was still active, as the Doctor discovered. She decides to evacuate all the humans off Gallifrey because, they all show up to save the day. We see another nice classic TARDIS interior before she sends them home, but she stays behind to bring it all to an end. One thing I will say about this, regardless of being a bad episode, Jodie Whittaker is great here, and I think having her go up once again against Sacha Dhawan as a Master is a saving grace. I have to say once again that Dhawan steals the limelight in this episode, whether it is everything we see in the ruins of the capital or inside the Matrix. Seeing this final confrontation with the Master and the newly created Cyber Masters
was quite tense because of the performance of these main actors. So huge props goes to Dhawan and Whittaker for this. The Doctor is about to use Ashad's tiny dead body to kill everyone. It's funny to think that she's using something that looks like an action figure to save the day here. And this includes herself. And for one moment, you get the feeling that she's just had enough. She's had enough of fighting the Master so many times, along with those damn Cybermen, and pressing that button can destroy them for good. It is a similar predicament to what the Ninth Doctor found himself in The Parting of the Ways, when he was ready to activate the Delta Wave, killing everyone on Satellite 5, along with the army of 500,000 Daleks and the Earth below. But he didn't go through with it in the end, and here the 13th Doctor does not either. I get the feeling that Chris Chibnall may have watched the series 1 finale before writing this scene, because there's a lot of similarities, sending the companions back to Earth, having Jodie say things like "have good lives," and face one of her oldest enemies with the original intent to make sacrifices to save others. But Coach Sharma shows up, and he takes the device of the 13th Doctor. She gets out of the place, and she grabs a TARDIS, and Koshamus ends up blowing everyone up to Kingdom Come. Yeah, we're definitely not going to see the Master or Cybermen again in the future, are we? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I think moments like this are good, but I was already feeling negative because of the timeless child plot and treatment of the Cybermen in the episode. Plus, the device which was in the Shad's chest was a get-out-of-jail-free card by Chibnall. Why would the Cyberium create a device which could potentially destroy the Cybermen when put in the wrong hands? I get it could have been used in order to purge all organic life and the rest of it, but looking at the grand scheme of things, I don't get it. And in the end, the only purpose I can see is that that chest device was there just so that Koshamus could show up and save the day. But hey-ho, the Doctor lives to save the universe once more thanks to Koshamus' efforts. She leaves the tree TARDIS behind, because TARDISes can be trees, finds her own TARDIS in a quarry somewhere, has a moment to think about what the hell all that shit was all about in the episode she's just been in, and then the Judoon land in the TARDIS, because you thought that this episode wasn't mad enough. Yeah, let's have the Judoon just turn up yet again. By the way, it's nice to see the Judoon once again, and a revisiting of the plot from Fugitive of the Judoon. But Judoon, you've got the wrong Doctor. This is a Jodie Doctor. The one you're after is still out there somewhere, remaining unexplained for the foreseeable. And another thing, how the hell did the Judoon get in the TARDIS? I thought the hordes of Genghis Khan couldn't get through those doors. Well, the Doctor is in another dilemma, and in Tennant's style, she asks what multiple times, which was unneeded dialogue, and she ends up on a prison ship, which looks suspiciously like Sharda, a cliffhanger which leads us to the next festive special, Revolution of the Daleks, and there you go. I must play the waiting game again for this show now. As stupid and awesome as this cliffhanger is, I'm excited to see how the Doctor gets out of this one and how she reunites with her friends who are back on Earth. So there you have it. Series 12 finale is done and dusted. I know I've sounded mainly negative due to the timeless child reveal, but in all honesty, it does nothing for me, and I'd be lying if I was saying that I was best pleased about it all. The way all our villains are defeated again is a cop-out. The redeeming features I think it has is the entire cast. Despite some bad writing, they do give it their all, and even some of the other guest characters, who I wasn't really that fond of across the two-part finale. But Jodie Whittaker and Sacha Dhawan are the highlights. Some other moments, which I failed to bring up before, but I'll bring up now. Near the beginning, on the cyber ship, and that's when Graham and Yaz and some of the Resistance disguise themselves as Cybermen. I did wonder before the finale came out whether everyone would make it out alive, and while a couple did die, While a shad stares into the cyber shell with two of our main characters inside, I did think we may have lost Graham and Yaz here, especially after they both shared a bit of touching dialogue just before this. But again, this could have been said at any point in this series. I felt it was random, but it was nice too. It was nice that they did have that character moment, even though it was just placed at the most random moment. Cybermen are coming in, but first we'll just have to have a little conversation. I think the companion who did not do much in this finale, or the majority of this series, is Ryan. I think he had more development in Series 11, and personally, I think all he did here was kill some Cybermen with something that looked like a basketball, because... Oh, do you not remember? Ryan played a game of basketball in the first episode of the series. Chris Chibnall was like, yeah, see what I did there? Yeah, I saw what you did. You took something from a scene which I didn't care about, and I suppose maybe not many cared about, and then you reminded us of it in this episode. But still, I'm not taking away from Tosin Cole, because he does the best with what is given. One thing I can definitely say, especially with Series 12, is that this TARDIS crew is crowded. If there's anything I'm going to be positive about more than anything else, is that at least this did feel like a proper finale, and it's not the worst finale in the revived era. I was still happy to see returning elements, such as the Citadel of Gallifrey, a mention of the Doctors and Masters Jules in the Panopticon, which was a reference to their deadly assassin, and my favourite part was seeing Ruth Doctor again inside the Matrix, and the flashback to all the Doctors with the confirmation that the Morbius Doctors are canon. I am still excited to see my favourite TV show come back for Revolution of the Daleks. Also, this may not be my least favourite story of the entire series. If you have been following this whole review, I'm sure you may work out which one I did not like the most out of this series. To conclude my review for Doctor Who Series 12, there was a marked improvement here over previous series, I feel. After Series 11, I thought that the show was heading in the right direction, with a new showrunner and a new Doctor. Now with 2 series under their belts, Jodie Whittaker has improved as a 13th Doctor, although I do stand by what I said at the beginning, that her character is all over the place at times. But that's not a dig at her acting at all. I believe that Jodie Whittaker needs a story like what Heaven Sent is to Peter Capaldi, something which most of us can agree is an exceptional episode which could define her era. The closest we've seen was Fugitive of the Judoon, but that story also featured the Ruth Doctor, and I hate to admit this, but her character felt more like a Doctor I'd be used to. I still believe the show is going in the right direction. For a few times this series, I had that feeling of excitement for this show. It's a level of excitement which I have not felt in at least 5 years, and that's good enough for me. I look forward to seeing how the Doctor gets out of space jail and seeing her fight once more against her most feared enemies in Revolution of the Daleks. And I look forward to watching Series 13, which will hopefully come out in the next year or so. My love for Doctor Who cannot die. Stay safe, everyone. Make the most of the rest of your day, and make my day by subscribing right here for more Doctor Who reviews. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Now it's time for the final scores.